Hi guys, Josh Munday here, and you've just heard me play a part of VOODOO CHILE Slight Return by Jimi Hendrix. That was off his third and final studio album in 1968, Electric Ladyland. So for this recording, we're not entirely sure what Jimi Hendrix used. We know he probably used his Strat and strung upside down. What amplifier? We don't really have confirmation of what that amplifier was. I've read a bunch of different opinions about what that might have been. Everything from his Marshall Super Lead, cranked, to a Fender Basement head with an 8x10 cabinet. So it could have been a bunch of those things. But let's just have a look at what the four elements of tone that we can investigate in order to reproduce that in the Boss GT-1 multi-effects. So let's break down the components of that sound, and I like to do this in a process called the four elements of tone, which are the guitar, the pickups and the pickup selection within that guitar, the amplifier type, and fourth, the effects. So by effects, I mean not just your normal delay, chorus, reverb that you run into the front of the amp or in your effects loop of your amp, but also any effects that were done post-production. So any delays that were added afterwards, EQing, compression, mic placement in the room, what type of mic was on the amp, what position it was there another mic in the room, how did the room sound, all of these can affect the sound. So with something like the Boss GT-1, a multi-effects unit, we can not just reproduce the amplifier type and what it was like to be in the room, but also what it was like to be in the control room, hearing that sound after it had been mixed, which is the sound that we all fell in love with off the album. So firstly, the guitar. Jimmy probably used a Strat. He was famous for using Strats, a right-handed Strat strung upside down for him as a left-handed player. That did have the consequence of slightly changing what the single coil and the bridge would sound like, being that it's angled backwards. So it makes the lower string slightly brighter, top string slightly duller, but it's a fairly subtle thing, but we can probably work around that with some of the magic inside the GT-1. So that's the first, the guitar. Secondly, to me it sounds like the neck pickup that he's using quite a bit. It's a bit more of that hollow, darker sort of tone from the neck pickup. Then onto his amplifier, which again was probably a Marshall Plexi Super Lead or perhaps the Fender Basement. Regardless, it's a very cranked amplifier with quite a loud room mic as well, I can hear in there. The great thing is, after the introduction, we have the wire introduction, and then we have the big riff where he's got a fuzz on, and then just before he starts singing, he switches the fuzz off, and you can get an insight into how that clean amp sounds. So as a starting point for us, it's a nice reference point. So we're going to go with a Marshall. That's, to my ears, basically what it sounds like, and then we'll add some room miking, we'll add some effects, delays, and the fuzz, and then finally the wah. Not only was Jimmy's guitar strung upside down, but he was also tuned to E flat in this. Now, because I was playing this in amongst a whole bunch of other sounds as part of a medley of tunes that I have, I didn't want to have to retune the guitar or play it in E. I wanted to play in the original key. So the GT-1 has a pitch shifting, so we can set that to -1, so we can pitch it down to E flat to start with. Now, we should always do that first if you're going to do that in a multi-effects or in any unit, because the process of pitch shifting actually does change the tone of the guitar somewhat. So we need to do that first so that we've got that reference point to build the tone off. So in the signal chain, the first thing here is effects 1 or compression. Now I've got that set to -1 in the pitch shift here. So here's pitch shifting and -1. No fine tuning and effect level at 100. So here's the sound without it. And as I turn it on, we're in E flat already. So it's a good starting point. Next, let's go to the amplifier type. In our preamps here, I have a Marshall 59 channel 1 selected. Gain, it's sort of a nominal amount because that's the best way to hear the character of the tone. If you've got too much gain on or too less, you're not going to really hear the character of that amplifier. So around halfway is a good starting point so we can hear that. So let's turn on the Marshall. Okay, so that's a good starting sound, but we probably need the amp slightly cleaner and a bit more mid-range in there. That old-fashioned recording process really added quite a honky sort of sound to it. So let's add a bunch of mid-range into that amplifier. We just go over to the next page where the EQ section is, and I'm going to crank that mid-range right up to the top and give it a bit more top end. Let's have a listen to that. Okay, so that sounds much closer to that clean sound that he has when he turns the fuzz pedal off before he starts singing. Now we're going to add the fuzz. Here in the overdrive section, you can see we have a clean boost on right now. So I'm just using that to push the front end of the amp a little bit harder rather than adding a fuzz pedal. So let me turn that on. Okay, so that's getting much closer now, but there are a few subtle things missing. Obviously the wah, we haven't turned the wah on yet. But within that recording process, if you listen really closely, you'll hear two things. One is a slapback delay that's panned to the other side of the track. So we can add that. With our FX2 here, I've got a sub delay on. So you can select a separate delay than the actual delay part of the GT-1 signal chain. So now I have a delay selected there. I'm going to turn that on. Now I've got 0 feedback, which means there'll only be one repeat. I have 190 milliseconds there, and effects level about halfway. Now if I go over the page, you'll notice that this is a panned effects. So the delay will be flicking to the other side, just to one side. Okay, so let's have a listen to that. Now that's almost there. The last part I'm going to add here is another delay that simulates the microphone that's in the room at the time. Certainly for older Hendrix albums, I'm not sure for Electric Ladyland, I can't quite figure out or find enough interviews to find the exact details, but for earlier recordings he'd have a microphone in the room roughly 12 feet away from the amplifier speaker, which can have a very definitive slap and change the EQ of the sound in the end. Now we can simulate a mic in a room with a single delay. So we're going to turn the delay on here in the actual delay section. I've got that set at 12 milliseconds. Now each millisecond simulates roughly a foot away from the speaker cap. So 12 milliseconds reproduces a 12-foot microphone in the room, roughly. Feedback at 0 because there's only one repeat, which means it's only the time that it takes for the sound to travel from the speaker box to the microphone. And depending on how loud you turn this up, I have it turned up to about 80% there, quite high, because I want it to change that tone. So let me flick it on and off and see if you can hear the subtlety that changes the tone. So firstly off. And on. And finally, just a little bit of reverb to simulate the room sound that was actually recorded in. Now, of course, the last thing we need to add is the wah that's used at different points of the introduction. So let's turn that on and have a listen. The wah type I've used there is also a Vox Wire. Hendrix quite famous for using those classic old Vox Wires. So I've selected a Vox Wire for the pedal as well. And now we can turn that on and off with the expression pedal switch at the front there by pushing down on our toe. But the way I've used it in the medley and you see me perform it is I use the control pedal here to simultaneously turn off the wah and turn on my overdrive pedal. So when I click that, you'll see the overdrive pedal turn on and off, and the expression pedal turn on and off. And you can see in the performance at the start, if you rewatch that, where I flick over it between those two.